the Jesus way.
Oh, the Jesus way
Is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way.
Oh, the Jesus way
Is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When he is king, all wars will cease. May his peace begin with me.
Jim Lehman is one person who has been an inspiration to many in the Church of the Brethren. He is a writer and a storyteller and an advocate for social justice. A few years ago, he wrote about the early Brethren, and I would imagine he has a few things to say about the modern Brethren. Hello, I'm Brent Carlson. Welcome to Brethren Voices. Today, we are so glad to have Jim Lehman with us. Jim, welcome to Brethren Voices.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you here. Jim, you have done many things in your life. You've been a writer, you've went to seminary, you've written more than one book, you've published a magazine, you've conducted workshops from 45 minutes to a week long, you've raised a family, you've been a husband, and I bet you've traveled a bit. Am I leaving anything out?
That sounds good.
It all sounds good. No? I want to talk to you about what makes a good story, but I also know that you started a publishing company to publish stories of your own and other people. So how did that happen?
Well, that goes back a long way. I actually, in the 1970s, after I finished The Old Brethren, I had a sense that I wanted to continue writing, and I started writing a novel. And I'd been reading Charles Dickens at the time, and I felt this desire to publish this novel and to do it serially. And so here I am, a young guy who'd never written fiction, writing his first bit of fiction, his first novel, and I decided to publish it in 18 monthly installments and sell it for $15 by subscription. And I did that project complete. I lost money. I had 1,000 subscribers, which is kind of amazing, I think, for somebody as inexperienced as I was. So after that, I did a second novel, a much less expensive format, and published it weekly. I was still working at this serial idea. So that was what got me started with publishing. And then when I decided to do children's books, I wasn't just interested in in being a self-publisher. I was interested in being a publisher who also published myself. So after the two books that I did that were my own, I did another children's book by another author, and then I also began to do an occasional periodical called Telling Voices.
I have been reading
That's
Telling
your
Voices.
segue.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that too, because I've been reading that with a lot of interest. So when you're publishing, when you're a publisher, how do you select the material, and then do you do everything yourself? Did you do the layout? Did you do the editing? Did you do the printing?
No. Because I'm a very small operation, I don't have a staff, so I will hire a freelance editor, and I'll hire a designer to do the design work. I'll hire an illustrator if it's a picture book, and then find a printing company that is appropriate for this particular project. And as you may know, printing is such a highly segmented industry now that the printer you would go to do something like Telling Voices is different from the printer you would go to do The Old Brethren, or the printer you would go to do a picture book. So you need to know that and need to know how to select the company.
Telling Voices, when did it start, and is it still going?
It's not still going. It started in, I believe it was 97. It was inspired by the storytelling movement that came out of these Song and Story Fest that Ken Smeltzer has been the leader and has provided the energy for. I thought that there was some good material coming out of there, both the stories that were being told and also the songs that were being sung. Many of the songs were original material. Bill Jolliffe, a Quaker singer and songwriter and musician who's been coming for many years, especially, was doing a lot of his own stuff, and they were songs that I thought other people ought to know about. Sean Kirshner, who's probably the most gifted musician we have in the Church of the Brethren, was doing some material. So I thought it would be a good concept to do a periodical that combined both these songs and these stories. And so that was the genesis of Telling Voices.
In reading the stories, I then started to think, well, what makes a good story? How long should a story be? And there's a difference between a story that's written and a story that's told. And you might be the best person to ask that.
Well, there isn't a length that's somehow right, but there is. It isn't determined by the number of words or the number of pages. It's determined by the story itself. How involved is it? What really needs to be told in order to make the story come alive? And in some instances, a story can be short and to the point. In other instances, part of the pleasure of the story is the way the author kind of draws you in and keeps you going and keeps you involved. So what I look for is the length that works. And of course, in the case of Telling Voices, I was publishing people who were accomplished storytellers. And the question of length especially comes into play when you're telling a story, when you're doing it orally. You have to hold your audience attention. And if your audience, if their eyes begin to glaze over, you know you probably need to take that part out of the story, or you haven't told it successfully. And of course, that's what an editor does with the written story. A good editor can say, okay, I know these words seem golden to you, the author, but this isn't working. You really need to take this out and it'll be a much better story. And I've been on both sides of that discussion. I'm an author, and I don't like an editor to tell me to take something out. And I'll argue with an editor. And if I'm editing, I'll argue with the author. And out of that interplay, you get a better story. Because the editor's job is to be the first audience and tell the storyteller, the writer, what's going to really work.
I was also thinking while I was reading the stories, the stories don't have to be all true.
Of course not. How do some storytellers? Storytellers will say, "Well, this may not have happened, but it's true."
I've heard that.
You've heard something like that.
Yeah.
Stories have truth because they capture some human reality. You can make up a story that has truth that a factual story may not have, because you've created something that goes to the heart of what it means to be a human being and captures some larger spiritual reality. And that's true.
Well, you may not know, but you're famous for a story you told at the BVS luncheon at annual conference. And we're going to play a little of that.
Okay. Now I want to tell you a story about something that most brethren can agree on. And it's also a story of passion, but a different kind of passion. After World War II, the young adults in the Church of the Brethren came to have an enlarged vision and a great deal of energy. We were still mostly farm people. These were farm kids. But the war, I think, changed everybody and everything, and we just became more aware of the world, whether we were farmers or whoever we were. And the young people of that era began to think about the globe. And I think some of our global consciousness, if it didn't start there, but that post-war period gave us a tremendous boost. And these young people began to meet together. And at annual conference in 1947, a man named M.R. Ziegler, many of you know that name. He's one of our Brethren heroes. He was in charge of Brethren service in Europe. And he came back telling the young people stories about the suffering that he was seeing in Europe. And the National Youth Cabinet called for a round-the-clock prayer vigil for peace that began at that conference. And that evening, it was after one of the sessions, and M.R. Ziegler used to say, "It's the meeting after the meeting that's the meeting." They were talking, and Kermit Eby, who's another Brethren hero, a man who was very active in the labor movement, he said, if you want the Brethren interested in peace, you have to get the ideas of the young people out into the churches. I would say that's true today as well. And so for that whole year, the young people, young adults were thinking about this. Some of them were going back from conference on the train, and they decided to keep this prayer vigil going. They were thinking, they were moved by what was happening. And the following summer, no, it was later that summer, in Salinas, Kansas, they had a work camp at Peace Institute. And Dan West came and gave leadership. And Dan West is another of our Brethren heroes. And these young people were so moved and so excited that they extended the 2-week camp to 3 weeks. They actually had schedules that permitted that. Wouldn't it be nice if we had that kind of flexibility today? And they, at the end of the institute, they lighted candles and put them on little pieces of wood and floated them down the stream that was near the camp as a symbol of the light that was going out into the world. Well, they kept these prayer vigils going for a whole year, and so they really came into annual conference in 1948. They were stoked. They were full of prayer, but they were also full of the, excuse the expression, the piss and vinegar of young adults. They were a little dissonance there. They began to meet at conference, and they began to cook on an idea. Now, Dan West was in the background. We all know that Dan West was somebody who was stirring things up, and he was like a Pied Piper. Young adults of that era, those who are still living, and many of them are, just talk about Dan West's magnetism and how they followed him. And one of the people who was involved in those discussions was a woman named Alma Moyers. Alma Long is her name, her married name. And she's still living. In fact, she'll probably be at conference. And she is a spirited lady. I don't know what she was like as a young woman, but she must have had a lot of energy. And she and Dan were on a radio program, local radio program. The Brethren do that sometimes, local community. And she just found herself saying, I interviewed her many years later, she said, I felt moved. She said, I told the radio interviewer that the young adults were going to do something at this conference. And they had not yet formulated their plan. And they continued to meet and they continued to pray. They had a prayer vigil every morning. And they decided to bring to conference a proposal for a volunteer service program for young adults. Now, the idea was not completely new. Brethren had been doing volunteer work for a while, but the idea of a program especially for young adults was a new way of conceptualizing service, and it was fueled by what was happening in the world. Now, you have to know, those of you who are Brethren know this, but those of you who are not who have never been a part of the Brethren way of making decisions, you know how things come to annual conference. They start at least a year and a half before. And they have to go through often a congregational decision and a district decision, and then they come to standing committee, which acts as a gatekeeper for annual conference business. Now, occasionally a Brethren group or a Brethren agency can bring a query to annual conference directly through to standing committee, but that's fairly infrequent. Generally, it has to go through this process, and an item of business never comes to annual conference floor without going through standing committee. And it never comes to annual conference floor without being on the agenda several weeks or months ahead of time. So these young people wanted to do it now. So they appointed a committee to go and talk to the moderator. And this is getting toward the end of the week. This is Saturday morning. Saturdays, in those days, the way conference was done, Saturday was the last day of business, Saturday afternoon, morning and afternoon. And the moderator of conference that year was a man named Calvert Ellis. Now, I knew President Ellis many years later. He was the president of the college that I went to. And he was a fine man, and he was an open-minded man, but he was a person who went by the book. He saw the value of good procedure, and he followed it. And the young people came to him, and Alma told me, she said, I was afraid, because in those days, people really looked up to college presidents. We still do, but not quite as much. And they brought this proposal. Now, Dan West had coached them a little bit about how to approach it, and she was one of the people, this young woman in front of this patriarchal man. And amazingly, he didn't immediately say no, but he made it clear that it was going to be probably unlikely. But he had a conversation with the other officers. Paul Bowman, who was also college president, president of Bridgewater right here, and Paul Robinson, who would eventually become president of Bethany. They were all men, unfortunately. In those days, there weren't any women up on the podium yet. In fact, in this particular situation, a woman's point of view would have been very helpful. But one of those men, and Paul Robinson remembers that he said it, but other people say it was Paul Bowman who said it. Doesn't matter. One of them said to Calvert Ellis, "Brother Ellis, I really think you need to listen to the young people on this one." And so, and if there was ever a moment where the Spirit moved in the Church of the Brethren, it was right here, because Calvert Ellis broke procedure and said to the young people, "I will allow this item to come before conference this afternoon." And he worked out a signal with the young people, and it was decided that a young man named Ted Chambers would make the speech, and another person, a young woman, they were, that was a good thing, I thought, Charlotte Anderson would also make a speech, but Ted would put the motion into play. Now you have to know that Ted was only 4 feet 8 inches tall. And so Dan West found an orange crate. Calvert Ellis gave the signal, and Ted Chambers walked down the aisle carrying his orange crate and set it up in front of the microphone. You know how the microphones are in the aisles of annual conference. He climbed up in the orange crate, and everybody's laughing. And he said, "By the way, I am 22 years old," because he looked like about 13. And then he gave a powerful speech and put the motion into play. We started recording annual conferences in 1949, so we don't have that speech. And everybody I talked to, I interviewed Alma, I interviewed Paul Robinson, none of them can remember what he said. Which is probably a good thing, because you mythologize moments like that, which I'm doing right now, and you make them to be powerful because they say something to you about who you are as a people. And then Charlotte made her speech, and the discussion happened, and the vote was taken, and it was a unanimous vote. When was the last time that happened? And the young people, the young adults were all grouped up at the balcony, and they were so delighted they broke into applause. In those days, you never applauded during annual conference business. But the whole body was filled with the enthusiasm and excitement of these young people. And one of them, a man named Edson Sowers, some years later said, "It was as though we took conference by storm." Now, isn't there something in the Bible about how the Holy Spirit is the wind? And Alma told me, she said, it was like Pentecost. And another amazing thing, that was in the summer. By September, the program was up and running, and the first unit met. Now, when was the last time we put something into action in 2 months? The last thing I want to say is that one of the people who was in that first unit and who later served as training director and also as director of BVS was a man who was a great lover of Song and Story Fest and would come every year that he could. And he's not with us this year because he passed away just a few months ago, and that's Rodney Davis. And I think maybe Rodney's family is the best represented family here. And I just felt that we needed to remember Rodney because he loved BVS. And he was in that first unit. He was one of those enthusiastic young people. And I love to tell this story. I love to tell it to young adults because we really can do things. We often feel like there are impediments in our community of faith, but they're more in our mind than they are in reality. It really is possible to have a vision.
That's a great story.
I really like that story. I like telling it because I think that was a very unusual moment in our history as a church. in the order of annual conference, and again there's that word order, things do not come to the floor of annual conference without going through a process, generally coming through a district, coming to standing committee, and in this case, the young people wanted to bring this to the floor of conference, and the officers allowed it to happen, and as the story shows, this reality called Brethren Volunteer Service, which is one of the best things we do, came into being. It's a great story of how a group that believes in order can also have flexibility.
You were also instrumental in developing Voices for an Open Spirit. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I was feeling, this was in 2002, and I was feeling that maybe the Church of the Brethren needed something on the liberal, progressive side of the church that was similar to what Brethren Revival Fellowship had been for the more conservative side of the denomination. And I went and talked to a few people about this idea, and I decided to try it. And so at this point, this was entirely on my own initiative. The conference was in Louisville that year.
For the people who don't know about Voices for an Open Spirit, can you explain a little bit what it was?
Well, I will. That's what I'm
I'm
getting
sorry.
to.
Okay.
That's all right.
I'm sorry.
What I did was I rented a room in a hotel, and I printed up a little brochure. I actually used that term, Voices for an Open Spirit, and just circulated it. This was completely unofficial. I just rented the room. It was my own effort, and it just happened that the night that I'd scheduled that was the night after the decision was made by annual conference that gay and lesbian people could not be licensed and ordained. And so all of a sudden there were 200 people spilling out into the corridor because people were upset and they wanted a voice. And so that was how it began, and it has been a way of giving voice, not the only way, there are other organizations giving voice to the progressive side of our denomination.
Do you think more churches are becoming open and affirming?
Well, there are more. It's a very gradual process. Each year there are a few more. It's not moving rapidly.
I think in other congregations, I've been surprised to find out there are many more churches that are going that way in other mainstream churches, and the Church of the Brethren has been reluctant to make that move.
That's correct. Yeah, this is. There were some big defining issues in the 1880s that caused the church to split, and this has been a defining issue in our denomination. Other things are connected to it: the question of biblical interpretation, how you go about the Bible, but the focus has been on sexual orientation, and it's been painful, and we still don't know how it's really going to finally play out.
You were instrumental in another thing called Song and Story Fest, which is one of the wonderful things that the Church of the Brethren does. Can you talk a little bit about its beginning and what it's like to be a part of it?
Well, it came out of some discussions that Ken Smeltzer had with, I think it was Lee Crambuel and my wife, Peg Lehman, after they had done some singing at one of the annual conferences. And Ken got this idea, and he was at the time, he and his wife Bonnie were pastoring the Modesto Church of the Brethren in California, and they would that district, Pacific Southwest, would do a family camp up at Peaceful Pines, which is up in the mountains, and so Ken decided to do a Song and Story Fest as family camp, and he called all of us who were his friends around the country and said, "Would you come and do this?" And we didn't have any idea what it would be like. It turned out to be magical. The musicians were great, the stories were good, and we just had a wonderful time up there in the mountains for a whole week. And so the next year, the Oregon-Washington district decided that they wanted to replicate this at Camp Myrtlewood, and asked Ken's permission to invite all the same musicians and storytellers. So it wasn't officially a Song and Story Fest. And Ken was already, I think, thinking that maybe this would be something that we might want to do more than just once. And so Peg and I went, and we were at Camp Myrtlewood, and by the second day, I was thinking, you know, we really have to do this more than just these 2 times. So I called Ken. I said, Ken, you got to come up here. I said, we're really having a great week. And so he did. He and his son Jesse got in the car and drove up. And it was after that a number of us thought, you know, this is a good concept. We're going to keep it going. Ken is the one who has spearheaded it. And without his leadership, something like this always has to have at least one person for whom it's a calling. And Ken has this vision, and he's just done a marvelous job of not just keeping it going, making it something that is really precious. And with each year, more people become connected, so that now our Song and Story Fests are always more than 100 people.
Really?
Yeah.
You also have become a mentor and a role model for many people. What is that like? Do people call you and ask you and seek your counsel and advice?
Sometimes they do. I guess I would admit to being pleased if somebody thinks that I have something to offer. Careful about it though, because each person has to figure things out, and so the temptation is to give advice, but the best way of being helpful to someone is to listen and ask some good questions. And I'm tempted sometimes to the old bull, give advice. Try not to do that.
Well, thank you very much for being with us on Brethren
welcome.
Voices. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me. Thank you, Brent.
Thank you very much.
All right.
This is Brent Carlson for Brethren Voices, wishing you peace.
Oh, the Jesus way
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When he is king, all wars will cease. May his peace begin with me. All those who tread
All those who tread
the path he trod,
the path he trod.
all those who tread
All those who tread
the path he trod,
the path he trod.
all those who tread the path he trod shall be called the friends of God. May his peace begin with me. Oh, the Jesus way
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When he is king, all wars will cease. May his peace begin with me.